It's about to go down with Marc and Cathey, a live coaching show about dropping ideas. Marc and Cathey coach and have conversations with brilliant idea creators who are reimagining the world through the expression of their words, thoughts, and actions.
Hey, everybody. I am Cathey Armillas, and welcome to It's About to Go Down.
And I am Marc Williams, and we are joined today by one of my close personal friends, my co-storytelling coach. She is an award-winning poet, and she is an advocate for women's justice. This is the one, the only, Roxy Azari. And Roxy, first of all, Roxy, thank you for being here with us on It's About to Go Down.
Thank you for having me here.
Oh, absolutely. And we can't wait to have this idea conversation with you about the topic you're bringing today. And the topic you want to talk to us about today is how to use storytelling to create community. So Roxy, tell us about this idea. How did you come about this idea? Why are you so passionate about this idea? And why are you the one speaking about storytelling, creating community?
Well, I don't even know where to begin. Well, I guess to begin, I'd have to start at the beginning, which is that I was raised with a family that loved oral storytelling. So my family is from Iran, and my grandmother used to recite poetry to me as a little girl because she was taking care of me while my mom was at work. And I think my love for poetry and storytelling and just the tradition of oral, I guess, stories came from my grandmother. And then that developed into reading a lot of Shel Silverstein and Dr. Seuss, and just being a little girl and being very curious about different worlds that we can create with words. So I used to, I still remember my first notebook was a random football notebook that my grandmother got somewhere. Somebody just gave it to her at a store, and she gave it to me, and that became my poetry notebook. And I would start to write, and I would just create these worlds that didn't exist. And I think as an adult, when I started writing poetry, I guess as a young adult in high school, my poetry started getting a more social justice lens of looking at racial equality, gender equality, all versions of equality, to be honest, and with a very high focus on gender. And from there, it turned into, it followed me into college. I created a club for people to be able to share their stories on stage via poetry. And then that turned into designing a 1-year project. It was called the Watson Fellowship. It still exists. It's an IBM fellowship where they award, I think it's either 20 or 40 individuals a year. But they have to be individuals whose ideas are they're inseparable from their identity. So the idea that you have, it has to come from a very personal place. And my idea at the time was, because my family is from Iran, and I would see how the West portrayed Middle Eastern women, North African women, Muslim women, Asian women as oppressed. And I would see that happen a lot, especially if it was a Muslim woman. And knowing that, I come from a family that's half Muslim, half Christian, and knowing and seeing how, inspiring my aunts and cousins are in Iran, and thinking that is not their narrative. They are like the most boldest women I know. Like the things that I have heard them say to men in the street, I don't have the courage to say here in America. So I was grappling this idea that, this was around 2009, 2010, where there was a lot of Islamophobia. And so my project was looking at how one piece of cloth meant so many things to different women around the world. But the narrative that we had heard in the US was that It's oppression, and it can only be oppression. And there are circumstances where, maybe it is oppression, but in many circumstances, it is choice, it is fashion, it is interpretation of religion, it is safety. There's so many different connotations. And so I talked about in my application how the day that I arrived in Iran just so happened to be election day. And I just so happened to be wearing a green veil. And at that time, there was something called a green revolution, but I didn't know because it had happened while I was in air. So when I landed, my cousins were like, "You're the most courageous woman we know, walking in the airport with a green scarf." And I was like, "What? I just chose this because I like the color." And that is where sort of the idea came of meeting women around the world, interpreting what their religion means to them, what their activism means to them. And because poetry was my starting point, I chose to do these sort of communal workshops where we shared stories, where we had discussions, where we would write poetry. And I created a curriculum. And in each context, I would work with a translator. And I would try to bring in poets from the countries that I was in. So we would work together to find different ways to dissect poetry that would be more relatable because it's contextual. And we would also talk about American poets, American storytellers, but we would, the way that I structured it was that we would sort of dissect together and write together and share together and play games together. And before I knew it, it was a whole year of doing that in 6 different countries with these incredible, inspiring women that have been through, in some cases, so much injustice and still fight for other women to not have to experience those forms of injustice. So it was really beautiful to see how just by sitting around in a circle and talking to one another, we could create such a supportive community. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I tried to start with the origins of where this idea comes from.
Oh my gosh, Roxy, thank you for that. I think sometimes I think Marc and I could be guilty of this a lot, right? We hear an idea and we're like, oh, let's build on this idea. And sometimes to hear where the idea was born is really critical. Like you said a lot of things today that I didn't know about you or your background or your family, or I just know you're like this badass poet. And so for me to hear like what comes, before this and where that love for wanting to create the community comes from through stories. I love that. I love that. I want to ask you a question. With your grandma, you were growing up and you said your grandma, like you really learned a lot to learn to kind of tell stories and make that part of like how you grew up. And now, with this project and what you did, what would you hope that people would do? Like, what would you hope that they would do with this? If they were to do their own version of what you did, what would you want them to be doing? Like, what would that look like? Because that'll help us kind of form how we can kind of talk about this idea.
Yeah, definitely listening. I think that something that we talked about in our initial call was that I think so many people are eager to share. But I was always very eager to listen, to learn. My idea of these workshops was honestly to learn, to sort of come to understand my own identity of why I'm so torn as somebody who feels like the Western representation in the East isn't correct and the Eastern representation in the West is correct, and learning from everyone what their relationship to their activism, to their religion, to their everything is. So I think one thing that I would recommend is really going in with the intention to listen. I didn't go in with the intention that I knew more in any of my situations. If anything, my imposter syndrome is very big. So I would go into situations thinking I don't know anything. I had a different kind of problem. And I would also say, if you're thinking of doing something like this and it's in different communities, doing research and making sure that the work you're doing is contextual and with people versus like superimposing your ideas onto people. And I think that was really important to me because I was a double major in women's and gender studies and English literature. And I had my own, set of understandings of the way that the world works because of that. But that may not be someone else's experience or someone else's understanding. So I really wanted to come in with not from a judgmental place, but from a place of like really listening. And a lot of the times, because I was working with women, a lot of them would share that they've never had spaces to safely share these stories outside of like with a friend. And so sometimes what we were talking about was sexual harassment. Sometimes it was domestic violence. Sometimes it was, religious violence, where like in some communities, your religion determined the amount of resources that your community would get. And so every context was very different. So I think being aware of the contextual history of where you are and your own positionality in being there, the privileges that you carry when you walk into the room.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. It's interesting that you asked that question, Cathey, about how to replicate it, because I do think that that's such a core of where to take the idea. And I think you already so beautifully answered this question. So I'm really gonna answer the question backwards because I feel like you've already answered it.
Sounds good.
This whole idea that Cathey talked about, like, how would you want other people to replicate these circles, these communities? And what came to mind for me is, how do you convince people to create these communities where they use storytelling and poetry?
Right.
To not just share. And I love the beautiful part about that, to not share. This is not like I'm coming out to perform my poetry. It's I'm coming out to listen to other people's poetry and stories. So how would you convince, or how would you influence other people to actually have these types of circles?
I think, especially if you're working with young people or even groups of people that you need to, sort of break through to understand something, whether it is that you want to help them through some form of trauma, or you want to learn about a context, whatever it may be. If you're looking to build community, I think having these sorts of circles is so important, where people feel safe in sharing their stories. So going back to Cathey's question, I think another thing that I would encourage is establishing trust and a safe space when you're doing that. And the ways that I would do that personally were through icebreakers and through sharing myself, so that it wasn't like I was an observer. I was also part of this circle. There wasn't a hierarchy. It was that, I'm struggling with these things. And at the time I was much younger than I am today. This was about, I want to say 12, 13 years ago. And so really feeling like we're learning together and creating that trusting circle. So one of the things that I used to do when I would first meet everyone is do a fun icebreaker, to sort of break the ice, to share that this doesn't have to be like trauma, like filled time. This can be a fun time to build community. And actually, I want to credit the amazing poet that inspired me to do this icebreaker. Her name is Ioka. She's from Boston. Incredible artist. And she used to come to my school, my college, every year. And she's actually one of the first performers I had seen that would do a workshop when she came to college. And she inspired me when I started touring and doing college shows to do a workshop with students, because it meant so much to me when I was a student to have a space to share, to learn, to grow. And she had this specific icebreaker that she would do that I just loved, that involved a ball. And every time you caught the ball, you added to the poem on the board. And then you would free write from that poem that you wrote on the board. And instantly, like every time I've done it in a workshop, we instantly feel so connected because we started with the same 4 lines and then we took it somewhere personal for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of the first things I used to do when I would walk in was introduce myself. We would say our names and then we would go straight into the icebreaker just to create laughter. And actually, before I would do that icebreaker, I would do a game called Zip Zap Zop, which is a theater game where you have to really focus and pay attention. And it would instantly fill the room with laughs. And then we would move to writing. And it was a really great way to just break the barriers, especially since there was language barriers for me, and really get to know one another outside of language and just laughter and joy. And so I would say, if you're looking, going back to your question, Mark, if you're looking to, if you have teens that you work with that are just not in the mood to talk, sometimes having a space where they're writing and sharing their feelings is really helpful. Or if I know a lot of people who go to work with incarcerated young people, incarcerated women, men, to really, all genders really, but to create spaces where we can process what we've been through and release it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so the things I took away, Mark, that she said that were important. So, and to me, I'm gonna break it down. How I'm seeing it, Roxy, is mm-hmm. like you have the things that you're actually doing when you are creating community through the story. Mm-hmm. And then the idea of like, how do we pitch this idea to people to mm-hmm. incorporate it more? So there's kind of really two cool things going on. And I know, Mark, you and I can definitely appreciate some of the things she's saying that are actually the technical, functional things that you do once you get into a room. And I think they're awesome. But I wanted to repeat these because I thought they were really important, and maybe we could bring them into the other idea so they could cross over for us. But the listening, you talked about listening, you talked about doing research so that people are understanding the context and not imposing their own ideas on people, and then the safe spaces. So those were the 3 areas. And the safe spaces, of course, was helping to establish the trust and whatnot. And so I think those are really important. And it made me think, Mark, I don't know where your brain went, but it made me think, when do we need to listen more, right? Like, where are the places that we need safe spaces? When and why would we need to be doing more research if we're trying to connect with other people? And so my brain was already like wired on that, like, oh, that should be part of how you pitch the idea. Because in some ways, the idea sounds like it just sounds like something that, oh, that's really cool that Roxy did it. Mm-hmm. But it sounds like a really big thing, as opposed to you could break it down to the level that anybody could do it. And then that idea becomes, that idea can spread like wildfire if we could break it down to the individual level. Those are my thoughts on it, Mark.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would also add, and I love the direction that we're going in. And it's so funny you said that, Cathey, that, oh, this was a really cool thing that Roxy did. And Roxy, you do cool things.
Yeah, that's true. You do cool stuff.
You do cool things. It reminds me, though, of this age-old thing, and this is the power of ideas, mm-hmm. that there's going to be a time when, you're looking back, and it's like you created this awesome idea, and it only lived with you, and it can't. Right? Mm-hmm. It's got to be done, because the trauma that you're talking about, the safe spaces that you're talking about, like those things, hopefully not for a very long time, but maybe as long as humans exist, will always be around, right? So we'll always need this space.
Right.
So I love the fact that Cathey's already getting us to think about why, and why do we need to listen more, and why do we need to do that research, and why do we need these safe spaces? And of course, my brain is around the how.
Yeah.
Which I think is the second step. I think we need to talk about the why first. But I'm always curious about how do you do that? Because we all know people struggle with listening.
Yeah.
Oh, whoa, yeah. When she said it number one, I was like, well, I just knocked everybody out. Like, I mean, in all seriousness, some people do struggle with listening, but it is important. And I thought when she said it too, Mark, I was like, that sounds really cool to even be like, this is a listening workshop. I mean, you know how when you go into something with a different mind frame, that even kind of made me think like, this is a listening space. This is a listening workshop. Because you're here to hear everybody else's stories, right? I know. I see Mark's face looks like your brain is breaking right now. I mean, it was the first thing that she said, and that's why I reiterated them, because I thought maybe we can talk about some of that. You know, Roxy, I think the barrier as humans that we have, unfortunately, is a couple things. We all have stories, easy, right? You could ask anybody in the world, what's your story? Even how you explain to us your connection to stories itself, like you've had a story about it. And so everybody has them. Everybody has stories about things that they've done in their life, or where their past is, where their kind of their culture, their family, their upbringing, things that they've done. And we have problems as humans when our stories when they don't seem like they meld, is kind of, I think, where people have problems. So I wonder if the stories that create community, it's the answer or the antidote or the how, Mark, if you wanted to the idea, which the idea might be something before that. Does that make sense? So the idea might more be along the line of, I don't know, I'm just going to spitball something out there. I mean, the idea might be more that we need to cross-pollinate our life experiences or our stories, right, or our communities or something like that. Yeah. And then the answer or the antidote to that is through story.
Yeah. I think, is it okay if I piggyback off?
Yo, please, yeah. That's what it's all about.
Because one thing that had really stayed with me in my studies in undergrad and in my master's, but this whole Watson year was after my undergrad year, before my master's. And it was this idea of conscious raising, which I had learned about in class, where women were, like, back in history, getting together and they were sharing their stories, sharing experiences, maybe is a better word, of what had happened to them. But through these conscious raising workshops, they learned that, oh, like, this was happening to you there, but this was happening to me on this street. And it was sort of connecting the dots that their personal experiences were political experiences, that it was part of a much larger structural injustice. Mm-hmm. But we don't see that if we don't listen to one another and hear each mm-hmm. other's stories. And so I think maybe people would roll their eyes at me saying this, but I think employers could learn a lot listening. It doesn't have to be a story circle, but listening to your employees' experiences of, this is my experience as, a Black woman at this company, or this is my experience as a, gay man, you know what I mean? And so right. I think even though what I'm talking about is very grassroots, I do think that corporations could learn a lot if they listen to their employees, because the impact of your company is more when your employees are happy to be working there, and so I think this idea of when we speak and listen to one another, we can also start connecting the dots to see a bigger structural problem that maybe needs to be addressed in society.
It's like we need to listen to learn, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And there's also just one last thing that I'll say is, I think that when we're talking about really big structures like racism or sexism, it can be really hard. It can be really easy to negate someone's experience by saying, like, racism, sexism doesn't exist, or these things don't exist. But when someone is sharing a personal experience or story from their life, it's very hard to say that didn't happen to you. You know what I mean? And so yeah. I think that when we're focusing on our personal stories, there is a learning that happens. And I'm not saying that that burden should be on people of color or women, or, it shouldn't be on the marginalized groups. But I do think that if somebody from that marginalized group wants to speak, listening is so important, because I think we learn about what their daily life may be like in a different way than like when you read it in a history book and you can say, oh no, this didn't happen, they're exaggerating or something.
Roxy, can I ask you something as a follow-up to that then? Because, we all love our storytelling. And we all know that part of the magic behind storytelling is mirroring, right? I see in you. But I wonder in this case, because this is what you made me think of, is that sometimes a detriment? Because when we are, when we're mirroring, we're also comparing. And then as we're comparing, we're thinking about us, right? Almost like I can't wait to tell Roxy this story now that she brought it up. Does that get in the way of this conscious raising consciousness, or in the plainest term, really listening to other people? I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, one thing I'll say is, one of the things we teach over at Story 2, which Marc, you're familiar with, is that when you tell a story, there's 3 things that happen in your brain. And one of them is that your memories get activated, your emotions come alive, and you want to take some sort of action. So oftentimes when we hear stories, our first reaction is in relation to the person. It's like you feel connected and you're like, oh my God, now I want to share. And I think there's been neuroscience studies on this showing like what happens in our brain when we hear each other. So I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing, that the person gets inspired to want to share their own story. I think that if the person is someone that carries a lot of privilege, it would be great to check in and just figure out if this is the right time to share, or if like right now, this space is so rare that person should continue, releasing the things they want to release. But I do think that synergy of sharing is so great, because you learn from one another. I don't know if Cathey, you feel the same or.
No, I totally do. I think that we're all seeing a different piece of it, because Marc, that thing that you said like Roxy said, that's not a bad thing. And I could see that it kind of made me think of this thing. I wrote this down one time. I had this thought. I was doing like a storytelling training. I was thinking specifically about why, I was trying to get to the like really heart of the psychology of why stories work really well. And I came up with this line that was like, something like my story is your story, just a little different, right? And it just meant that like, I'm going to say something that you've had an experience with as well, but it's just in a different way. And so Roxy, what you're saying is 2-part, is like, number 1, listen to other people, because you might hear an experience that you didn't know or didn't understand. And also you'll probably feel connected to something. And then Marc, you were saying it will make you want to share yourself. I think the beautiful thing that's coming up in this idea, at least for me, it's like, if I was coaching you, Roxy, and I was like, okay, you're going to give a TED talk tomorrow. What are we talking about?
You would need to coach me on my imposter syndrome first. And then
I would coach that right out of you. I'd be like, look at all the beautiful things that you're doing. You are living proof. You're living this. It's so great. But Roxy, one of the things I think I would start with, and Marc, I don't know if you're thinking the same thing, is I am hearing a lot about, and I'm going to start here because I will preface it and say, I think this might be very cliche, but I think that the power of listening to somebody else is where the idea, what the idea really is. And it would be our job to say, okay, Roxy's doing this thing. She has this idea, but the idea is kind of, this is the generic idea. What's kind of the specific or unique idea that we could talk about? And that's what I think if you guys agree, I think we should talk about that.
Yeah.
I like that. I like that a lot. And I'm just going to throw one thing in here that I think maybe we can tackle on a little bit later on, because it's been on my mind ever since you started. We've been using the word storytelling. And yet, going all the way back to your grandma, and I know that narrative poetry is a form of poetry and storytelling. Yeah. I know, I taught that lesson in school. But there's something that resonates with me about the fact that this really goes back to the form of poetry. And you know, we do hear a lot about storytelling, and we love that.
Yeah.
What's resonating with me is, how do I listen to somebody else's poem? You know? And like I said, we can maybe go there at some other point, but I'm just curious about this. That's what's been on my brain, that word poetry.
Well, Marc, you really, you know, one of the things that you said, Roxy, that I was like, oh, it's so beautiful. You know, the exercise where you're having the 4 words and then people are writing their own. It's like everybody started with the same prompts, the same whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then everybody filled in, and everything that came after that was part experience, part life, part, you know, part their filters, part who they are, part where their, you know, their cultural experience. And it's such a beautiful thing that none of those can be the same.
Yeah.
Like it just won't. It won't be the same.
It won't. Like, just to give an example, one of the times I was doing one of these in Massachusetts, and the 4 lines we wrote were so random. Somebody was eating Pop Rocks that day, that candy that like bubbles in your mouth. And the 4 lines, I still remember them. It was like, Pop Rocks are delicious and they have pizzazz. Pop Rocks, something, something. And then it was ... And the poems that were written that day brought us to tears. Like, one person wrote about Pops being in jail and how like he was like, he's learning how to forgive his father for not being there. Someone else wrote about like growing up, like loving candy and like developing an illness, like the ways that people's like their creativity, their experiences took them in such a silly exercise. Like, I really didn't expect that from Pop Rocks have pizzazz, like that we were gonna go into tears after. But it really does, like, once you're given that space to reflect, it sometimes just flows out of you.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah.
The prompting goes so many different ways. Pops, candy, like people are thinking different things. I love it.
Yeah.
And I think we're in this space right now where what we're talking about is a lot of things. We're talking about the power of listening. We're talking about the power of everybody's different stories, the power of listening to people's experiences, the power, even Roxy, I'll even go down to the granular level. I love something that you said is like, you can dismiss something very large. You can say, the world isn't racist or the world isn't misogynist. Like, you can dismiss a whole thing, but you can't really dismiss somebody's experience.
Right.
You just can't. Their experience is going to be their experience. And so that to me, that's the power of the individual experience, is that it's, you own it. Nobody else has agency over it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah.
Marc, I'm going to ask you from a coach to coach. Just a knee-jerk question. It might be a little bit of a mini game. It's just like, you know, if she were to give a TED Talk tomorrow and you're like, oh, we're running out of time, what idea stands out to you that you would tell her, this is how I think you should present this idea, or this is what you should consider? Just what comes to your mind?
I don't know why the phrase "listen to what's different" is just, I don't know, you just inspired me on that one. but that's what's coming out of me right now. Because I do think that there's a power in the listening. I think there's a power in acknowledging that when you listen, you start to pick up on the differences. And that's what we're really listening for in this particular case. That's what's jumping out at me. I want to even expand a little bit and talk about reflect and release. Just because those are two words that you've said, Roxy, that really stood out to me as well. And I think they're very much connected to the whole idea of listening. Mm-hmm. I don't think we release enough. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that we reflect enough. As a matter of fact, I'll go on that tangent and say this. I think one of the most difficult things that we as a human society struggle with is actually reflection. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes in order to reflect, we do need to open up and listen. We need to listen to others. Sometimes we need to listen to ourselves a whole lot more. And sometimes I think that's what gets in the way. We're so busy wanting to talk, and get out what you got to get out so I can talk. Well, why is that? Well, I probably haven't figured it out because I haven't really reflected, you know? So I think there's something there about the reflection and the release that also stands out to me. Back to you, Coach.
I also think that the reflecting allows you to have a different ending. It for me anyways, like when I'm reflecting on something painful, sometimes it takes me years to reflect. It doesn't happen right away. But it allows me to take control maybe in a situation where you don't have control, whether it's something scary or a breakup or, you know, whatever it may be. I think that you get to have a new interpretation of it when you're looking at it in hindsight that maybe helps, depending. I mean, I'm not certain traumas, but certain experiences.
Cathey, what do you think about that phrase, reflecting allows you to have a different ending?
Why did you rip the words right out of my mouth? Why did you do that? I was actually going to show you guys that I wrote down 3 statements and where I was going to tell you it started from, said this statement, I wrote it down. We need to listen to learn. And then Marc, you said, listen to what's different. And then Roxy just said, reflecting allows you to have a different ending is what she said. And I even thought us reflecting allowed you, Roxy, to get to that line.
Yeah.
Just, ironically, no pun intended on the whole statement. But part of what we're doing in this conversation is reflecting. We're talking about what you said. We're dissecting it. We're having a little reflection on it. And I think if you go from what we started with and where it ended, that would be an idea that I would be like, wow, see, that's a different way to say the same thing, and it comes at it from such a unique angle, like, because then it makes you, because all the components are there, right? You're like, reflecting allows you to have a different ending, and then like I could see how you're backing up that, if that was the idea, you're backing it up with, well, where does that reflecting come from? Well, it starts with telling your story, being able to express your story, hear other people's story. You can't reflect by yourself. You have to be able to hear other people's stories. And so anyway, you can go really deep into it, but now that has a unique angle that people weren't expecting, I guess.
Yeah. And I can even think of real examples from my life of like how time gave it a different ending. Like there's a story that I shared on PBS and World Channel, which was about and Marc has heard this story several times, but it's about a family friend who came to America for the first time, was so excited, was going everywhere. He didn't speak English, so I was his translator. And the whole story, the first time I ever wrote it out in a poem and the first time I ever told it as a story, ended at this couple with a Western accent telling his wife, don't help them when he wanted to take a photo. And that's how the story would end. And then when I was typing it up to share it on TV, one of the people said, you know, what happened next? What was the next thing that happened? And that caused me to reflect on, because the whole story talks about how excited he was. He was just like, I love your magnets. I love your pigeons. I love everything. And then there's this like moment where this couple just doesn't want to help him because he's speaking Farsi. And when the person asked me what happened next, I was like, oh, I never thought about what happened next. What happened next was that another couple saw us, and then they offered to take our photo, even though like we were heartbroken. And then he turned to me and he said, don't let people like that get to you. And it forced me, when they asked me that question, what happened next, to see the beauty in that hard story versus just focusing on the pain of it. And again, I'm not saying that this could happen with like everything in life, because there's some traumas that I don't want you to have to, you know what I mean? Have a different ending because what happened was wrong. But this helped me see it in a more, see the beauty that was there in the darkness, if that makes any sense. And so I think sometimes like these sorts of reflections cause us to see a bigger picture than what we were in.
I got to tell you, that is always one of my favorite stories that you have. And I was just looking at Cathey's reaction, like it's so heartfelt, but I don't think I've ever heard you tell
the first version. Yeah. The first version was very depressing.
Ending it just at the couple that wouldn't help. It's so powerful. There's so much power in that too. I think it causes, talk about reflection, it causes people to maybe look at their own traumas. And then, and again, I totally agree with you, Roxy. Marc, I talk about this a lot. When we're having conversations about things that could be traumatic, I'm always like, oh, we better, make sure that we preface it so that we're not telling people how to digest things, of course. But I think if I think about my own personal traumas, like I can look at something that happened when I was a kid and then look at it when I was an adult and have a totally different lens or outcome on it because of understanding the bigger picture. And there's so much power in that reflection. But if it just ended at that moment where the bad thing happened, holy cow, how can anybody handle that? So that's so powerful.
I got to tell you, that question, what happened next, is so powerful.
Yeah.
Because you're right. We don't necessarily want people to always find like a different ending. Sometimes you really need to. But the cycle of life is there is something that happened next, right? Whatever that means, the good, the bad, the whatever.
Yeah.
But that's a part of the reflection that sometimes we kind of get stuck in where the story ends, where, here I go, English teacher again. We used to always say, a story never ends.
Yeah.
Stops or it pauses, right? But there's always something that happens next.
Yeah.
Never really get to that without the reflection.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that is so brilliant that you pulled that from that, Marc.
I love that.
No, it's so brilliant. I like what happened next is such a creative way to tell somebody that they need to reflect.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I'll add is that I co-facilitate with a therapist these workshops for survivors of sexual assault and gender violence. And she does a lot of the clinical stuff and I do a lot of the storytelling aspects. And one of the things she teaches, her name is Claire McHugh. I hope I'm pronouncing her last name right. She's incredible. She talks about how for survivors, what are some actions you took after to sort of shift the narrative? It doesn't change what happened, but to also see the resilience and the strength in them as survivors of like, look at all these things you have done. You are more than this story. And this story is a big part of you. But we have multiplicity of stories. And so we're very particular about how we do that, because we don't want them to think that we're trying to diminish the experience or find a silver lining in it, because we're not. There is no silver lining. None of this should have ever happened. But we also want to honor who they are, like the beauty that is in them, the strength that is in them. The way that she does it is so perfect when we're doing those. And it is, in a way, it's not the question of what happened next. It's the question of like, what are things you've done since then? Do you know what I mean? Like it's looking at, it reminds me of what you said, Cathey, which is that, and Marc, which is like the story, your story as a human isn't over. And your impact is, not over.
That's why I don't even see this as a silver lining.
Mm-hmm.
It's the next chapter. If you want to talk poetry, it's the next stanza, right? It's the next, right? I'm not trying to make you feel better about what is really tough.
Right,
but
exactly.
Life is a continuous story.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened next? Or what could you do? Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's really good. And I could see, Roxy, how you were saying that like Claire, like will get down. Again, it's maybe just a granular level of saying like, what did you do? But, if you were to tell it in a generic way, you're asking in the scenario, in the story, what happened next?
Right.
It's like the story.
And in those contexts, it's like the participants in those workshops are there because they want to tell their story and they don't know where they want to end it. So sometimes, sometimes they may want to end it with the abuse that happened, but sometimes they may want to focus on other things at the ending. And so this gives them a place to really think about, where do they want the story to end and who is their audience? Is it their family members? Is it a big, hall of people? Are they signing a petition for something to really figure out, we call it my story, my terms, because oftentimes survivors have to tell their story to the cops or to family members, but they have to modify it for the audience. It's never the story they want to tell. It's the factual story or and I should have given a trigger warning that I'm talking about this, but I think having some space to reflect on who they are, not necessarily because of this, but just who they are, helps.
Yeah.
I love that statement. Not who you are because of this, but just who you are.
Mm-hmm.
That was very powerful. And you also inspired me to write down this question. I'm trying not to get stuck on the word end, but that was just the word that I wrote for now. Where do you want your story to end?
Me?
Well,
I was like,
so that, but it was a very thought-provoking question for me, because it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier. Like, we all have these stories to tell, and we, under different conditions, right? Being stopped by the police, whatever. But we all have these stories to tell, but we do have a choice in how we finish that story or how we stop that story. And I don't know how people think about that, because we tell stories all the time and we probably always end them in the same place.
Yeah. But that also sounds a little bit, Marc, like you're saying, because like Roxy, it just happened to her. Like it almost sounds like that question's asking, like, how do you want your life to end? Or how do you want this? Like, it sounds like the bigger picture of your story, as opposed to, I understand what you're saying. You're saying in this particular story, where do you want to put the period?
Right.
Where are you in that period? Where are you choosing to end it, or what details are? Yeah, it's really interesting that where we ended up on is reflection, and how and where you cut a story off. Like even in these circles where you're listening to other people's story, it is interesting to know like where they chose to stop it. Very fascinating. Very, very fascinating.
We didn't even talk about movies and sequels.
Yeah.
Right?
Did you guys ever have that experience where you watched a show, like you're watching a show, right? And so it gets to the final, gets to the finale of one season, And then, of course, what the writers want you to think is that, oh my God, this person died or whatever, right? Like something majorly dramatic happened. And then you're like, oh, how are they going to get them out of this situation? And then the next season starts and it's like, wait, what?
It was a dream?
Yeah, exactly. Or something, right? Yeah, it was a dream, or that's what happened. That's how easily they got out of it. Wow. So it is kind of, that is a very fascinating thing about storytelling too, is you get to be the narrator. You get to share your version, your story, your terms. I like that. Your story, your terms, or my story, my terms kind of thing. Yeah, I don't know. There's something really cool in that. And I think that supersedes or precedes actually, because the whole, like, the story builds community. I think that's the beautiful outcome of this idea.
Yeah.
I think that's the beautiful outcome of that, when you allow people the space to tell their story, that it will create the community.
Right.
So I don't know. In my mind, it's like that's the outcome of the good idea.
Yeah, it creates like community, it creates connection. I think that connection makes that safety feeling warm.
Yeah. And I mean, it could flip the other way, right, too, Mark? I don't want to say that that's the only way. Like, what I mean is, like, in my mind, that's a great outcome for it. But the idea could also be that story creates community, and then you could go the other direction. I feel like this is a palindrome, right? Where it could go either way. It could flip the other way and be like, stories create communities, but in order for the community to be created, there should be listening, there should be safe spaces. And the only thing that I would challenge as a speaker coach or an idea coach is that we've heard those ideas spoken like that before. And as important as they are, if you really want an idea to take off, you have to learn to say it in a different way, right? That's the biggest challenge when cities or towns are putting together public services announcements. They're like, oh boy, all right, how do we say this thing that everybody's been saying? How do you tell people to not try drugs? Or how do you tell, how do you tell people to wear their seatbelt? When we've said it in the same way. So it's always trying to find that creative way to say it.
Right.
Which is why I love the phrase, reflecting allows you to have a different ending.
Yeah, that's, to me, same. It like that stood out to me as a better idea, because then it makes people lean in a little bit, Roxy, and go, wait, what? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, to me, I think that line and that idea can be so helpful on so many other levels. Because I think about when we sit down, we watch the news, we hear different things, and sometimes you hear things, dare I say, out of context, or maybe not in completion, or not with enough details, and we sort of just accept the amount of story that's been told to us without asking for that different ending or asking for what's next. And I can only imagine, when you think about all the different things that have gone on in the world, right? And the camera shuts down and we don't see any more of it. What are we not seeing? And how important is it to see that next thing that happened?
I like that. I like that too, because there's a lot of power, I would say. I'm now thinking, Roxy, of this, I'm thinking of it from a lens of like a therapist, right? Where somebody might be talking to you in therapy and they might say, tell me what happened before. Tell me, and that happens a lot. Tell me what happened. How did you grow up? Tell me where all this started. Give me the beginning. But there's so much more power in what happens next, even if it's not answered. Even if it's a question that's like, it hasn't been answered yet. Something could have literally happened to any one of us yesterday. And it's hard and it's traumatic. Question is still super powerful. What happened next? Or what happens next? Either way, right? Like,
I love that.
Yeah, it's a power. It's like an individualistic power gives the person the power. It almost does the same thing I think that my story, my terms does.
Mm-hmm.
It allows us to write our own endings if they're not even there. And,
Mm-hmm.
and it also allows us to look at it in a different way if it's already happened and it's already,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. There's a lot. Those are all, I don't know. Those are just things running through my mind. How about you, Roxy?
I'm processing. I'm doing the reflection part, listening to everything you're both saying, because it's just so powerful what you're both saying. So I'm just taking it in.
If I may add, what I found very empowering about what you just said was, this is not only about things that have happened in the past,
Mm-hmm.
but this empowers me now to reflect on what happened today and what I'm going to do next.
Right.
Yep.
There's a certain ending that I would like to have. I would like to see it play out this way. So what am I going to be doing next? So I love that this idea is not just about the past,
Mm-hmm.
about the present, and it's about the future. That's the power of next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh, I like that too, Mark. The power of next. This is kind of the power of next. Also, I can see in these communities too, that Roxy, where somebody's sharing and, you allow them the space to be able to share what their next is,
Mm-hmm.
like what did they do with the experiences that they've had, or what do they plan on doing? Like you said,
Mm-hmm.
Mark, it's past, it's present, it's future. It's all three. Yeah.
Hey, Roxy, can I just ask you a quick question before we start to...
Yeah.
Remember the story you told at the beginning about coming off the plane with the green veil?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That was so long ago.
What happened next?
Yeah.
So I think I can share this. So it was
If you don't want to, it's okay.
No, it was just so it was called the Green Movement, and it was sort of a movement that was created while I was, flying to Iran to see my family in 2014. And there were mass protests that had started out very peaceful. And so it was, my parents are going to kill me for saying this, but both my parents were very revolutionary, which is part of the reason why they are not in that country anymore. And so to be their daughter and to be there and to beg my family, please, can I go protest? Please, can I go protest? And they were very scared because there's a very difficult history between our countries, and they didn't want anything to happen to me. And because they were peaceful at the time, I was allowed to go. But when they stopped being peaceful, I was locked up, but understandably. But what had happened next was just lots of mass protests while I was there that felt very similar to the revolution in Iran in 1979 that I had read about in books like Persepolis and family stories from all my family. And it was a very surreal time because it was also before the Arab Spring. And it just so happened that when I was on my Watson year, the Arab Spring was happening while I was in Arab countries. And so it was just constant learning from movements and uprising and learning about more movements that I didn't know about. So I guess what happened next was more political consciousness that I was learning a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That was such a great question on that, Mark, because probably a lot of what you just said, Roxy, was because of the realization that you were wearing something green, and so then
Right.
you had to understand the context behind that. So
yeah, there was a lot of learning, because I knew that there was an election, but I didn't know it was such a big deal. And part of that movement was that people felt that their votes weren't counted fairly. And it started like an uprising of where's my vote? And they would write it in English too, because they wanted other countries to know that they felt that the election had been rigged. But when I landed, I didn't know that. My family had to sort of tell me everything that had happened while I was in the air.
Wow. Wow. Oh, well.
Sorry, and it wasn't 2014. It was 2009, I believe. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I've loved about our conversation today is it started in one place, and where I thought it was going, it ended up somewhere else. And I really appreciate the complexities and everything that we talked about, and the depth and the width that we've talked about in regards to this. And I know you care about it so much. So I have a question for you, and I'm curious how, you've been living this idea, you believe in this idea, you have backed this idea with your own actions. How has this idea changed since we've been talking about it in the last hour?
I think the part that has changed for me is that idea of like having control in situations where we didn't feel like we had it, by creating the ending we see fit for that story. I think that's what's staying with me the most, is this, I don't know, because so much of my own writing is pretty depressing. It's like the opposite of my personality. Like my personality is bubbly, but my poetry is like F you. Like it's like a very intense. And so I think it's even inspiring me, like, how can I approach my own art, my own reflections in a way where the ending is more uplifting than leaving people feeling helpless. Not that my intention is to leave them hopeless, but
right.
Sometimes the subject is so dark that, yeah.
There isn't that what's next moment, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. Well, I know for me, it changed a lot for me, in that I was thinking, oh, we talk about stories all the time. I think stories are really powerful. How do you make that a creative, like, how do you really get people to see it in that way? And then we got to this, and I was like, oh, that's deep. That's something different. Marc, how about you?
The power of next. The power of next.
I love it.
You didn't think we were going to end up there. And it's inspired a whole set of questions that I'll be asking at the dinner table.
Yeah.
They're going to find me asking these questions.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's even helping me, like, on a personal level of, like, in my own life right now, I don't feel like myself. Like, I don't feel like who I was or who I want to be. I don't feel like her. And having this conversation with you both is making me realize that that's okay. Like, there is another chapter, and it doesn't have to happen right now. Like, I will figure it out, and it's a part of life to not know it right away.
Yeah, I know. I love that. At some point you'll be going, oh, and what happened next after this chapter of my life was this thing, right?
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. I love that. Well, Roxy, how would people find you if they wanted to kind of follow you and see all the cool stuff you're doing?
Yeah. I do have a website. It's roxyazari.com. And I also, I'm Roxy Speaks on social media. And so if people want to know when I'm performing next, I haven't performed in a while, but I am looking to get back into it. So they can find out more there.
I love that.
Awesome.
I have a special request, and you can say no.
Okay.
Is there any, like, favorite poem of yours that you've written that you, even if you just did a line or two, that you could end us on?
Sure. I just have to think about which one. Well, so I have this poem that is about my childhood friend who was basically told that he can't cry. And so the whole poem is looking at the different ways in which we were raised, how he was raised with toy guns and I was raised paying teacher, and how I was raised knowing that closed fists didn't solve anything, while he was raised thinking that a closed fist symbolized power. And so the piece ends, after all those comparisons, the piece ends with, "But I know a boy who cried once, and each tear in his eyes symbolized an ounce of respect that was lost from his pupils and added onto mine while they slipped from the face. He told me that he would now be his family's disgrace, and I told him, there is nothing wrong with showing some emotion. Your tears rebel against society's demand, and there's more honor in that than obeying an oppressing command. He told me that I was the only girl who could ever make him cry. And in that, I found some enigmatic pride because it meant that I was the only person that made him feel human on the outside. Because in my eyes, it was never his peach fuzz, his voice, or the height of his stance, but his tears that indicated him becoming a man." And so it's
Oh my gosh.
it's one of my favorite pieces to perform, mostly because I feel like men don't often have that space to reflect on how they don't get to reflect or feel. And so it's one of my favorite pieces because at the end of shows, usually men will come up to me in tears and tell me how much that meant to them. So because they've felt that they've had to be this quote unquote strong, hard man for their family or their spouse or whatever it may be. And so it's one of my favorite poems to perform because I don't think that we celebrate the sensitivity of men enough.
Mm-hmm. Roxy, thank you so much for sharing that. So good.
Thank you.
I wanted to get a little taste of what I knew that Roxy was so great. Do you have that full performance somewhere, by the way?
Yes, it's online. I haven't put it online, but it is online in different forms.
Okay.
My favorite version, that one I think me or someone else put up, but it's me and my cousin performing it together, and she's on the piano. And that's my favorite version, just because of our connection.
Okay, I'm gonna have to find that. I'm gonna have to find that immediately. And anybody who's watching, please go find it, and please follow Roxy. And please listen to her words, and please understand that this is an important idea. Roxy, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for being on our show. Thank you for sharing your heart and your love and your empathy and your brilliance and your talent and your idea. And I hope that the conversation that we had today is just the beginning of you thinking about different ways to explore how other people can utilize your idea of telling stories to create community.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you both so much. It's an honor to be here. And I feel like everything I was saying is what we're doing, like reflecting, creating community, listening, all of it.
Yeah. And Marc and I have a community that you are now part of.
Yay!
Go Down community. For anybody watching, if you're out there and you know of somebody that has an idea like Roxy and you want us to have a conversation with them about it, please find us on itsabouttogowdownshow.com. But Roxy, welcome to our community, welcome to our family. Thank you for sharing your poetry, your stories. And until next time, like every time it goes down, and next time it'll go down. So thank you for being and watching. It's About to Go Down.
Thank you.